just about a minute past the hour, so we will go ahead and get started with this afternoon's 30 minutes to better change management using ITIL and Agile. My name is Nikki Haase, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at RightStar Systems. A little bit on my background. I am a designated ITIL expert and certified Scrum Master. What that means is that I have some background in these two practices, ITIL and Agile, and certainly have worked with a lot of customers on implementing solutions for change management and helping them with their change management processes. Over the past 15 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, as I've worked in this space, there's been increasing adoption or push for adoption of ITIL standards within IT organizations in the United States. And although incident, problem, and change are usually the first processes to be implemented, and it takes a little bit longer sometimes for configuration management to be implemented just because of the depth and scope of having to actually build out a configuration management database, I would say that in our practice, change management is often the area where we see the most resistance. And the reason for that is usually lies with the Tier 2 and Tier 3 groups, so the IT managers who are actually trying to implement solutions for the networks, for applications, and they have this dual role of having to support the ongoing infrastructure requirements as well as providing new and changed services for the business and according to the needs of the business. Because of this, it can be often burdensome for them to have to go through a change management process which requires a lot of time for input, sometimes of the change requests, and they're being told to wait for decisions made at the change advisory board meetings. So what I hope to do today is to be able to talk to you all about how to streamline change management processes using some of the teaching from Agile development. Now, Agile, by definition, is for software development lifecycle. So it's a little bit different than the support side of IT. But I find that when I'm looking at and reading Agile-related materials, I can very easily substitute the word software or substitute the word process for software. So in looking at how to design not just software, but the processes that support and surround that software. So if we look at the manifesto itself, one thing I would point out is this last bullet, responding to change. Agile methods are focused on quick responses to change and continuous development. Now, this whole idea of continuous development and continuous involvement shouldn't be foreign to anybody who's familiar with ITIL, because the fifth phase of the service life cycle in ITIL is continuous service improvement. So there is this idea of a cycle of changes. However, I would, and I'm sure a lot of people would argue, that quick response and change management in the ITIL world are not necessarily synonymous. So change management is often seen as delaying response to an issue or request. So that's what I want to focus on and see how we can come to some middle ground on that particular issue. In looking at Agile Principles, again, looking at how this is associated with processes as opposed to strictly strictly with software, you'll see Agile Principles means that changes are welcome. And certainly if we are going to be integrated with the business and responding to the needs of the business, then we do need to welcome changes and be committed to providing changes while at the same time maintaining the availability of our existing systems. one of the principles that I would highlight here might not be the one that you would expect, but it's number 6. And I'll talk a little bit later about communication. And I think that that's, if you go back to ITIL version 2, I think that that's something that was stressed more heavily in version 2. And I like it because I think that that's a really important thing to remember. When I teach ITIL foundation classes, usually there's 2 things that I want people to learn. One is the terminology, so we're all speaking the same language, but the second is the importance of communication and how important it is to, whether you have strictly ITIL practices or strictly Agile practices or some hopefully combination of what works best for your organization. I think it's important to communicate that to people, and especially, I know here it talks about face-to-face conversation, but it's important to have standard operating procedures so that at least people know really step-by-step what they have to do, and that can really help to streamline things so there's not a lot of questions, or what often happens, you don't have different change management processes by department. You really want to have a cohesive and predictable process to follow. Simplicity, so that's another item to highlight here. Now, for those who may be interested and perhaps not as familiar with Agile methods, there are a number of different methods for following Agile methodology. So there are different schools of thought, as it were. Agile is completely open source, so it's not as locked up as ITIL is. Really, the manifesto and the principles are just about the extent of the official version of Agile, as opposed to the 5 heavy books that you get in the ITIL world. But there are a number of methodologies for how this Agile can be practiced, and I'll touch on 2 of them here with which I'm most familiar. So I'll talk about Kanban and about Scrum. As I mentioned, I did go through the certification process to become a Scrum Master. So we'll start with Scrum. Now, just as the name implies, Agile is intended for quick responses, agility, and being able to provide results in what we call sprints, or these 2-week time periods. So this is an outline of the Scrum Lifecycle. So, and if you think of, I don't know how many people are familiar with rugby, but that's where the name came from. That you kind of get into this huddle at the beginning of each sprint, then go through, execute, and then you come back after each 2 weeks. So there is some upfront discovery. You want to make sure that you've got an understanding of the system architecture. You meet with the business owner, make sure that the team is trained in what they need to do, and then as you go through this actual process of sprints, what you're doing in each sprint is capturing a number of requirements, and in this case, the requirements are detailed in what is called user stories. So when you have a business owner, the business owner doesn't necessarily understand the technology behind what's going to be accomplished, but they know that, for example, they want ease of use or something more general, where it's up to the Scrum Master and then, of course, with the rest of the development team to determine how to best actualize these kind of general business requirements. So there is some discussion. There's planning at the beginning of each sprint. The developers then produce their work, their solutions, functionality for the software. And then at the end of each sprint, there is a review with the business owner and a retrospective for the team, so they can look at lessons learned, what worked well, what didn't, and start all over again for the next sprint. So it allows the team to be much more responsive. So for example, if the user stories change within a short period of time, then they can, the development team can respond very quickly. They don't have to start all over again with the discovery. They simply pick up the next priority, the next user story in the list of priorities, and go from there. Now, there can be releases at each sprint, or several sprints can be bundled into a single release, but you don't have the same challenge as with the waterfall method of development, whereby you start off a project, you gather the requirements, you come up with a design, you go heads down for months, maybe over a year, and you come to the end and you find that during that time, the business requirements have changed and you come up with a product that's really not useful to the organization. For the Kanban example here, this is taken from Atlassian's JIRA product. Some of you may be users of JIRA. And in a similar way, we have various phases. So we have planning, to-dos, we have the in-progress development work, we have the review, and then the completion, so when something is done. And it allows everybody on the team to very easily see what the levels of work are at each stage. And maybe if we're having some problems with code review, maybe there's a logjam or a backup in work in progress. There's this whole concept of WIP, or the flow of work. And the idea here is to keep the flow of work going. Don't have any unnecessary obstacles in the way. And for the, getting back to change management, it's that whole review and approval process that really holds us up. So you can see, in contrast to the principles of Agile, in ITIL we have 26 different distinct processes broken down into 5 separate phases of the service lifecycle. And change management is really the central process of the service transition phase. In ITIL terms, the goal of change management is to enable changes that will benefit the business. And so that it certainly doesn't mean we want to prevent changes, but we do want to minimize disruptions. So we don't want to interfere with the availability of our existing systems. When we say optimizing risk here, we mean we don't want to minimize it necessarily, but if there is a particular change that might have the 70% chance of success and the 30% chance of failure, it's up to us then to understand the needs of the business and whether they feel that that particular change is worth that risk. For changes, something important to understand here, especially when we talk about how this intersects or dovetails in with Agile, is the types of changes. And specifically, what we want to look at here is what we call a standard change. A standard change is a pre-authorized change. And now, why they came up with names like standard and normal, I'm not sure. It doesn't really seem that clear when you, at first glance. The way I always explain it is a normal change goes through the change advisory board process, where a standard change does not. And this really comes down to where is the level of authority associated with the particular change. The change process is often cumbersome because we've got, you're going through several phases just to achieve a change. Again, very different than the Scrum process, where you have sprints where you go from beginning to end to actual deployment within just a few weeks. Here we have the initiation of a change. The change then needs to be analyzed. Only after that is the change then approved and then put on a schedule of changes. So you may have have to wait for the next maintenance window. But there is also the concept here of review, just as there is in Agile. So the difference here is where do we put the level of authority? And I mentioned it's important to understand the concept of a standard change because standard changes allow for local levels of authorization for the change approval. And in a meeting recently, an industry meeting, we were talking about ITIL and Agile and how do you then enable a Scrum team to generate releases on every 2 weeks or maybe even more frequently without having to go through the change approval of the change advisory board each time. And the answer to that, and I think this is a very valid point, is that you grant local authorization to the Scrum teams. The expectation is that the team is practiced enough, they have the stability of their infrastructure, they have the appropriate levels of automated testing, that they can be trusted then to roll out these changes on a more frequent basis. So local authorizations allows us to implement standard changes. Now, if the change has a larger impact, we know the greater the risk, the higher level of change approval that's going to be needed. So if you have a change that's going to impact a group, then maybe this needs to go before the change advisory board. Multiple groups or services, then this might have to go beyond that to IT executives. Something that's very high cost and high risk may need to go before the change advisory board. Again, back to this concept of communication that I mentioned early on. The higher the level of risk, the higher the change approval goes. So it's up to, certainly if the Scrum team identifies that a risk needs to be escalated, then that does go up to higher levels of change approval. Then there needs to be communication from the top down as well. So there needs to be the communication and rapid communication really from the board of directors on down to approve those changes. So anything that can be done to automate the process certainly would expedite the process. So even this, really reinforces the need for good standard operating procedures as well as automated systems to communicate approvals when a change needs to be escalated for approval. So there are a number of forms of communication, written and verbal communication. Written communication can be in various forms. We have text, emails, websites. I would say that for standard operating procedures, it's helpful to have a document share or some type of system that includes the standard operating procedures. For Agile change management, using the ITIL framework, again, it goes back to this whole concept of standard changes and granting local levels of authorization. So you do have the ability using the ITIL tools or IT service management tools that you may have, where you can actually walk the teams through the process of capturing the change request type and very quickly entering that information along with the approval or kind of the signature of the person at the local level who's authorized to grant that approval, whether that's in most cases I would expect that to be the Scrum Master who would be entering that information and signing off on the changes that are made. I think another component that really unites Agile and ITIL is this whole idea too of continual service improvement. And this is a little bit more general, not quite as specific to change management, but certainly for most organizations, change management is a process that could use some additional scrutiny and improvement. So the Deming cycle is common to both Agile and ITIL. It's referenced in often in discussions of both. And here we can see that the Deming Cycle forms for ITIL the basis of the continual service improvement model. It's also the cycle that's referenced when you talk about Scrum. So for each Scrum, you plan, you develop, you review, and then take corrective action, or that the whole concept here of doing remediation at the end of each sprint. So when for planning for improvements to the next cycle. To drill down a little bit more on the ITIL framework, when we look at the CSI model, what is the vision? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? Did we get there? And how to keep the momentum going? Again, it falls right in line with the Agile practices that we talked about earlier. So for change management, I would say that it's certainly not Agile versus ITIL. Both methodologies look at the Deming Cycle for methods of improving services that are provided to the organization. I think that the Agile approach, and especially looking at changes and how much of the change approvals can be pushed down to lower levels of authority, is ideal for the adoption of the ITIL framework and change management in particular. And Agile can help to simplify those processes. So it's a little bit less than a 30-minute review for today, but I did want to be sure to allow time for questions. So if you can use the Q&A panel or the chat window, and Valerie may be able to help me with some of these questions. So I think that some of the questions that came up, will the presentation be made available? Yes, and this has also been recorded today. Here's another question. Speed is not always the answer depending on the type of business vertical. Quality is what the business is looking for. Sustainability and availability is key. The rigor of change management is there to protect the live environment. So this was from Rick. And I would agree with that. There are certain types of changes that do require higher levels of authority, and that's really the balance for the organization, is to determine which changes can be made without going through the full change advisory board. Let me see if I can go back to this. Is one of my favorite slides here. This one. So looking back at levels of authority and risk. So you have to, again, work with the business to determine which services are the most fragile. Certainly anything that has a high level of risk should not be, changes should not be made without full CAB or even higher levels of authority. There's another question here. Do I prefer or propose any change management or IT service management tools or stacks? Well, of course, RightStar as a BMC partner and Atlassian partner, there are a number of tools and integrations that we recommend for different sizes of businesses. So for larger organizations, the Remedy ITSM tools, and for smaller organizations, I would say cloud options, I think, are becoming increasingly attractive for organizations. So the Remedy Force platform can certainly be made to tailored to serve the needs of smaller organizations. And then I did show the JIRA Kanban board. So we find that a lot of organizations use Remedy or Remedy Force for the support teams, and then they pass off, usually through a connector in the change management component. So they'll capture requests for changes as user stories and then pass those to JIRA and put those through the Kanban process. So that's something that we find fairly often within our customer organizations. I'll wait just another minute and see if there's if there are additional questions here. If there aren't any other questions at this point, certainly if there's if you do have additional questions that you weren't able to ask during this presentation, you can always reach us at rightstar.com at our corporate headquarters telephone number or at sales@rightstar.com.